It is late in Miami, the kind of late where the city finally exhales. The highways are mostly empty, just long black ribbons sliding past pools of orange streetlight. Sodium lamps hum. Neon flickers over closed diners and quiet strip malls. And somewhere above that soft, distant ocean noise, Dexter Morgan drives home in silence. Inside the car, everything looks perfectly ordinary. A tired blood-spatter analyst finishing another day at Miami Metro Homicide. His badge is still clipped to his belt. There is a coffee cup cooling in the holder. The radio is off, so all you hear is the low growl of the engine and the faint rhythm of his breathing. But that is not the whole story. Because sitting behind the wheel is also one of Miami's most meticulous killers, replaying every moment of his night work, measuring every risk he took, and quietly checking the seams of the mask he wears for the rest of the world. Day and night. Analyst and predator. One man, two lives, separated by the thinnest possible line. This is the story of how close that line comes to snapping. Across every season of Dexter. Villains drift into his orbit and start pressing on the weak points. The blood slides hidden in his home, the boat moored just outside the city, the family and colleagues who think they know him. Some of these antagonists barely disturb the surface of his routine. Others walk straight into his kitchen, look him in the eye, and almost pull the entire life apart. Tonight, we are going to move calmly through that gallery of threats and near misses. From the ice truck killer, who understands Dexter's origin before most of Miami Metro even suspects a pattern, to Trinity, whose quiet suburban rituals shatter Dexter's illusion of control, all the way to the enemies in New Blood, who stalk him far from the humid streets of Miami. Each villain becomes a kind of stress test on the double life. Our guiding question is simple: who truly came closest to exposing him, to ending his freedom, to turning the hunter into prey, not just in terms of body count or brutality, but in how deeply they cut into Dexter's mask, his relationships, his supposed normalcy. When you lay them all out together, you start to see a different pattern emerge, one where emotional intimacy is often more dangerous than forensic evidence. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's take this slowly. Think of this as a long, quiet drive through the series, headlights sweeping over each season's main villain, pausing on every near miss that could have sent Dexter from the lab to the interrogation room. From the ones who barely brushed past his secrets to the ones who almost sat across from him in handcuffs, we will trace how the danger escalates and how thin that line of safety always was. By the time we reach the strongest of them, the ones who nearly ended the story for good, you may find yourself asking how Dexter Morgan stayed free for as long as he did. To make sense of that, we're going to slow down and lay out how we're judging the monsters in Dexter Morgan's life, not in terms of who had the flashiest murders, but in terms of who actually threatened to pull his mask off in front of Miami Metro Homicide and the people who thought they knew him. The first layer is simple on the surface: body count and scope, and inviting him to step over new lines. Trinity does it by showing him what a long-running double life looks like when the compartments finally leak. Then there is exposure risk. How close did this person come to putting Dexter on somebody else's table, or at least on someone's suspect board? Some antagonists barely brush against his secret, operating in parallel without ever noticing the quiet blood analyst nearby. Others bring the threat right to his doorstep, surveillance footage that almost catches his face, a shared crime scene, a missing piece of evidence that points toward his boat, his car, his habits. When you lay them all out together, you start to see that the strongest villains are not always the most theatrical, but the ones who make his day job and his night work collide. We also look at how deeply each villain disrupts Dexter's personal life and his code. Does this person endanger Rita, Deborah, Harrison? Do they force him to improvise, to lie badly, to kill in a way that breaks Harry's rules? A weaker villain, in our terms, might be beautifully written and emotionally rich, yet ultimately pose low danger to Dexter's freedom or identity. They might hurt him, but they do not corner him. Finally, each entry on this ranking exposes a particular weakness in Dexter: his attachment to family, his arrogance, his need for control, his faith that the code can explain away everything. As we move down the list, settle in, get comfortable with an ongoing question. Which of these people do you feel came closest to ending the story? And how does that answer shift as patterns of vulnerability start to repeat? So before we can rank which villains came closest to ending Dexter Morgan's story, we have to sit with where he spends almost every waking hour. Miami Metro Homicide is not just a backdrop, it is the stage where his mask is most convincing and most fragile at the same time. Fluorescent lit hallways, humming air conditioners, stacks of case files, leaning in tired piles on every flat surface. He walks those corridors with a box of donuts in his hands and blood on his conscience. Debra storms past him, swearing at paperwork. Batista pauses at his desk to talk about family or overtime. Masuka cracks another inappropriate joke over a microscope slide. And in the middle of all of that, Dexter quietly helps them solve murders, reconstructing spatter patterns and impact angles, while knowing that if anyone ever applied the same logic to his own life, the lines would start to converge. Because his methods are not just efficient, they are engineered to survive that building. The plastic-wrapped kill rooms, the careful victim selection, the meticulous cleanup afterward, all of it is designed with one question in mind: what would Miami Metro see? He thinks like his colleagues before they ever arrive on a scene. No stray fibers that would light up under Masuka's black light, no blood drops that would create a pattern he himself would recognize as sloppy, no victim whose disappearance will send Debra kicking over desks. And yet, when you lay them all out together, the circumstances are almost absurd. A blood spatter analyst with constant access to crime scenes, to evidence lockers, to internal databases. A man who studies blood every day, then goes home and keeps a curated collection of it in glass slides. In any other world, a string of carefully targeted predators disappearing from the same city over the same years. A strange forensic result that does not match the assumed killer. Dexter's behavior turning just a shade too intense when a suspect mirrors his own rituals. A surveillance camera that catches his car near a dump site. These are tiny ripples moving through Miami Metro, barely noticed, then dismissed, then half remembered later when a bigger case breaks. Now, let's leave one more thread open as we move into the ranking itself. People at Miami Metro did notice Dexter over and over again. They just failed to connect the final dots until it was too late. Some of the villains we are going to talk about did more than threaten his life. They brushed against the truth in ways that made the walls of that building bend, and a few of them came terrifyingly close to making everyone else finally see what had been in front of them from the very beginning. So, to make sense of those bending walls around Miami Metro Homicide, we're going to walk the whole path. From the pilot all the way through Dexter, New Blood, this is the story of every main season villain who stepped into Dexter Morgan's orbit and pushed against that carefully constructed mask. Not every random killer, not every one-off foe, but the primary antagonistic force that defines each chapter of his life. That means, as we move through the series, you will hear familiar names surface in a calm, steady rhythm. Brian Moser, the ice truck killer who understands Dexter's darkness before we do. Leela, who turns obsession into gasoline. Miguel Prado, who slips under the code and tries to weaponize it. Trinity, whose quiet routine hides a catastrophic storm. Jordan Chase and the Barrel Girl gang, turning violence into a self-help brand. Then Travis Marshall, the Doomsday Killer, the brain surgeon, Oliver Saxon, and finally the late series threats that close Dexter's story and drag him out of Miami into the cold. Settle in, get comfortable, because the structure underneath this ranking is simple, but the tension inside it. We will move chronologically by season, following Dexter's life as it actually unfolds, from early experiments, in control, to the frayed edges of New Blood. But within that timeline, we are going to rank these villains from weakest to strongest threat, so you start to see a gentle friction between when someone appears and how dangerous they truly are. A villain who shows up early might sit far higher on the danger scale than someone who arrives years later. For each of them, we will pause on the same set of questions, even if we do not always ask them out loud. How are they introduced into Dexter's world? How does their presence escalate, from background noise to something that keeps him awake in the middle of the night? Where do they come closest to exposing him, whether that is a crime scene overlap, a suspicious colleague, or a moment where his emotions slip and someone finally notices? We will look at the quiet details. Brian arranging bodies like messages only Dexter can read, Miguel standing too close to the truth of the code, Trinity walking through the Morgan family home as if he belongs there. When you lay them all out together, every moment where a villain brushes the line of discovery, you start to see how each one alters the trajectory of Dexter's life, his relationships, and the way he wears that mask at Miami Metro Homicide. There will be spoilers. They will not arrive as sudden shocks, but as slow, carefully lit scenes, with enough content to get comfortable. We're going to keep that same calm pace. This channel is built for that. Long retrospectives rather than quick recaps, patient storytelling instead of jump cuts, the kind of analysis that lets you drift in and out without losing the thread. When you lay them all out together, every season, every villain, every moment where Dexter Morgan's mask almost slipped, you start to see a different kind of pattern, and that is the space we like to stay in. So if this is the kind of story you enjoy having in the background as you unwind, this is the story of the channel too. We take one show, one character, one line of tension, and follow it all the way through. Sometimes that means tracing how the ice truck killer turns childhood trauma into a mirror Dexter cannot look away from. Sometimes it means staying with Trinity long enough to feel how his ordinary routines make his violence more unsettling, not less. If you want more of that slow burn breakdown, you can, very gently, tap subscribe and turn on notifications. You do not have to sit up. You do not have to break the mood. It is one small action that lets us keep making these detailed, sleep-friendly explorations of Morgan's world and other series that live in the same quiet, uneasy space between daylight and the kill room. Subscribing does not change what you are hearing. It just means that the next time we walk back into Miami Metro Homicide together, or the next time we follow a different investigator, a different code, a different almost exposed secret, you will not miss it. There will be more nights with other shows, other masks, other people who come dangerously close to being seen for what they really are. Now, let's let that thought settle, like blood spatter drying on white plastic, because from here, we are going to move into the ranking itself. We will begin with the villains who barely scratched Dexter's armor, the ones whose threats felt distant or clumsy, and then, step by careful step, we will work our way toward the ones who cracked his life open, who nearly put him on the table instead. The scale starts small. It will not stay that way for long. So now, as the scale finally starts to move, we begin at the bottom. Settle in, get comfortable. Because before we reach the monsters who press right up against Dexter Morgan's secrets, we have to spend a little time with the ones who barely leave a fingerprint on the mask at all. This lowest tier is not made of harmless people. Many of them kill, manipulate, or leave real bodies for Miami Metro homicide to catalog. On paper, they are dangerous. But when you lay them all out together, you start to see a pattern. They almost never corner Dexter, never meaningfully threaten his double life, and rarely get close enough to his routine to feel like a genuine exposure risk. They are storms that pass nearby, loud and dramatic, without ever quite hitting his house. These are the villains who function more like moving mirrors than hunters. A character like Travis Marshall shows us Dexter's fear of religious judgment and apocalyptic punishment, but for most of that season, the forensic danger stays oddly low. The investigation is chaotic, the symbolism is loud, yet Dexter's identity remains buffered by coincidence and institutional confusion. The threat is spiritual, psychological, thematic, more than it is a precise scalpel aimed at the Bay Harbor butcher. Like Doakes, they are not tightly woven into his family, like Brian or Trinity. They do not consistently overlap with his crime scenes, his boat, his lab work. Without that constant friction against his daily routine, their impact on the mask stays contained and short-lived, more like a disturbing dream than a sustained investigation. And yet, weak does not mean worthless. Some of these antagonists are stylish, eerie, or strangely memorable. They give us striking tableaus, tense confrontations, and moments where Dexter's code or emotions flicker. What they rarely give us is that suffocating tension where you feel your own chest tighten, where you genuinely wonder how Morgan walks back into the lab the next morning without handcuffs. From here, though, the air is going to change, because as we climb the ranking, each step up brings villains who move closer to Dexter's core, his work, his code, his family, his name on the door at Miami Metro. This is the story of that slow tightening. And the next group we meet will be the first ones who make hiding start to feel like running. And as that tightening begins, the series does something interesting. It gives us a villain who looks enormous on the surface, who fills Miami Metro's whiteboards and nightly news cycles, but who, when you lay them all out together, barely brushes against Dexter Morgan's actual mask. Season 6's doomsday killer, Travis Marshall, is that kind of threat. On paper, he is terrifying. He stages apocalyptic tableaus across Miami, turns corpses into religious murals, and seems to move in lockstep with his mentor, Professor Geller, in a shared mission to usher in the end of days. The imagery is grand, the symbolism heavy, the bodies impossible for homicide to ignore. But then the season, quietly, pulls the rug away. Geller is not a partner at all, just a fractured projection of Travis's guilt and delusion, a ghost that keeps him company while he unravels. That twist tells you something important about where the danger is pointed. Travis's violence radiates outward, toward a city he believes is corrupt, toward strangers who become props in his revelation drama. It is about his mission, not his curiosity. He is not hunting Dexter. He is not studying the blood analyst who keeps showing up at his crime scenes. His gaze is fixed on scripture and signs, not on the incongruity of a man who understands his work a little too well. So even when the crimes are gruesome and high profile, the pressure they create mostly flows around Dexter, rather than into him. Miami Metro feels the heat, the media swarms, the public panics, but Dexter's double life remains oddly insulated. We are going to notice that in most of their encounters, Dexter is the pursuer, not the prey. He infiltrates Travis's world under aliases, stalks him, studies him, folds him into the code as another monster who has to be stopped before the next tableau goes up. There are tense moments, of course. Travis takes hostages, slips away from traps, and turns familiar spaces into stages for his prophecies. The closest he comes to truly endangering Dexter is almost accidental, the collateral chaos that makes every move riskier. The city is on edge, surveillance tightens, and Miami Metro homicide is stretched thin, which means one misstep from Dexter could ripple much farther. There's something important about this world. There are killers whose chaos fills every headline in Miami, who turn the whole city into a stage, and yet never really step into Dexter Morgan's light. When you lay them all out together, you start to see this pattern. These are the villains who generate noise instead of pressure. Travis with his apocalyptic murals, the Bay Harbor Butcher task force, chasing an anonymous monster the audience knows, is Dexter. Even Jordan Chase orchestrating terror through proxies. The streets are panicked, the news cycles are relentless, Miami Metro homicide is drowning in work, but the actual line back to Dexter's life stays strangely untouched. This is the story of seasons where the danger feels enormous for everyone else, and oddly manageable for him. Because when a villain builds elaborate crime scenes, leaves theatrical messages, and invites cameras to every press conference, the spotlight becomes its own containment field. All eyes are on the prophet, the boogeyman, the brand. Very few eyes are on the quiet blood analyst who keeps showing up early and staying late. So Dexter can operate more comfortably. Not safely, exactly, but with a wider margin for error. If he seems distracted, people assume he is exhausted, like everyone at Miami Metro. If he is late to a scene, it is because the city is falling apart, not because he was wrapping plastic somewhere. The villain's spectacle explains away the oddities before anyone has to look too closely at Morgan himself. That is the strange safety net these externalized threats create. As long as Dexter does not leave obvious forensic traces, the sheer volume of chaos becomes camouflage. The evidence rooms are overflowing, the lab is backlogged, and every briefing is about the next ritual, the next tableau, the next predicted escalation. We're going to notice that in these seasons, the question is less will they catch Dexter, and more will Dexter catch up to the killer before someone he cares about gets hurt? But that does not mean these antagonists are trivial. They still work on him, just from the inside out. Travis tests Dexter's patience, with delusion masquerading as destiny. Jordan Chase tempts him with a version of power that discards the code entirely. Even the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation, before it turns toward Doakes, forces Dexter to hear his own crimes described in cold, procedural language. They are not cornering him legally, but they are eroding his certainty about what separates him from the monsters he hunts. And if you settle in, get comfortable with this idea of chaos as a kind of shield, you can feel why the later shifts matter so much. The real escalation comes when the villains stop radiating outward and start turning inward, when the danger moves off the news and into Dexter's lab, his apartment, his family. That is where the rankings begin to climb, and where the mask finally starts to crack from the inside. And then we leave Miami behind. The fluorescent hum of Metro homicide is replaced by snow, silence, and a man who calls himself Jim Lindsay instead of Dexter Morgan. We are going to step into that frozen clearing where the revival begins, where Dexter has traded palm trees for pine trees and blood spatter for a sporting goods counter, trying to convince himself that if he changes the setting, the story will finally change with it. On the surface, Iron Lake looks safe. Investigation. Here, the first real pressure comes from routine. Angela wonders why Jim is so private. Locals notice when he disappears into the woods for long walks with no clear destination. It feels less like a man being hunted and more like a man who has moved into a glass house without realizing how transparent it is. That is the key to why these early revival threats sit low in the ranking. They are atmospheric rather than surgical. The suspicions around Matt Caldwell's disappearance the inconsistencies in Dexter's backstory. Even Angela's early research into missing girls function like weather systems passing over him. They darken the sky. They do not, at first, trace a direct forensic line back to the Bay Harbor butcher or to the blood-soaked slides that once lived in his air conditioner. Instead, the exposure is emotional. When Harrison arrives, when Dexter feels the old hunger stirring under the snow, the real conflict is inside the cabin, not inside a police file. He breaks his decade-long abstinence from killing less because an enemy corners him, and more because he cannot keep pretending the code is gone. This is the story of a man whose mask is slipping from the inside, while the outside world is still squinting, trying to decide what it is looking at. The revival will eventually narrow its focus. A more defined villain steps forward, the investigations sharpen, and the threads of Dexter's old life begin to glint through the new name. But those early season antagonists never quite get their hands on the true secret. They circle his lies without touching his legend. And that is why, when you lay them all out together, they settle near the bottom of a list like this: tense, in the moment, beautifully uneasy, but never close enough to put Dexter Morgan himself on the table. Now, let's move toward the figures who do reach back into his past and see how the stakes change when the ghosts finally remember his name. Up to this point, we have been moving through the kind of villains who roar in the distance. They leave bodies in freezers, in shipping containers, in alleys drenched in neon and rain. They make Miami Metro homicide scramble. They make the news. They make you tense. But their gaze, for all its violence, never quite settles on Dexter Morgan himself. They are loud storms on the horizon. Dangerous? Yes. Capable of reshaping a season? Absolutely. Yet when you lay them all out together, you start to see the same quiet comfort running underneath. Dexter can still go to work in the morning, smile at Masuka's jokes, bring donuts, and know that the monster of the week is not really hunting him. They are hunting in his city, not in his life. From here, that changes. From this point in the ranking, every step upward brings us a little closer to people who do not just exist in the same world as Dexter, but begin to brush against his mask, his methods, his relationships. We are going to move from threats that are spatially close to him to threats that are personally entangled with him. Proximity is what matters now. A killer who dates someone at Miami Metro, who shares a quiet scene with Deborah in an interrogation room, or who happens to stand in Dexter's kitchen holding a beer, automatically carries more weight than a stranger, with twice the body count. Because the closer they get to his routines and his rituals, the more chances they have to notice the seams in his story, the odd hours, the unexplained absences, the way he is just a tableau or terrorizing the entire city. Instead, their danger comes from how specifically they threaten Dexter's mask and the fragile web of trust around him, Rita's belief in him as a gentle partner, Deborah's faith in him as her moral anchor, Miami Metro's assumption that he is simply the reliable blood guy. So, settle in, get comfortable, because the next name on this list is not the scariest killer in the series, not by any traditional measure, but they step just close enough to Dexter's real life to tug on a few loose threads, and if those threads had been pulled a little harder, a little sooner, the careful fabric of Dexter Morgan's world might have come apart in our hands. For Dexter, the next loose thread doesn't arrive with a badge or a case file. She arrives with a British accent, a recovery chip, and the promise that she understands the darkness he can never explain. Leela West steps into his life as his NA sponsor, then as his lover, and almost immediately you start to see the way chaos follows her into every room. On paper, Leela is not a classic threat. She is not a rival killer hunting in the same Miami streets, not a forensic mind inside Miami Metro homicide tracing algae and blood back to Dexter Morgan. Her danger works sideways, under the language of addiction. She tells Dexter that his true self is something to be embraced, rather than contained, and in doing so, she begins to pry apart the fragile suburban mask he has been building with Rita and the kids. This is the story of someone who never suspects the Bay Harbor butcher, but still manages to endanger the man behind it. Leela's primary weapon is proximity. She wedges herself between Dexter and Rita by validating every impulse Rita finds suspicious, encouraging Dexter to disappear, to lie, to choose intensity over stability. Every moment she spends in his orbit makes his double life harder to choreograph, not because she sees his kills, but because she keeps pushing him to live without a cover at all. Then, the escalation starts. First, it is the stalking, showing up uninvited, watching him with Deborah, inserting herself into his routines until you realize she is mapping his emotional weak points instead of his crime scenes. Then, the arson. The apartment fire that nearly kills Dexter and Rita's children is not about evidence. It is about control, about proving that if Dexter pulls away, she can burn the edges of his world. She even kills the only man who truly threatens Dexter that season, Sergeant Doakes, by blowing up the cabin. In saving Dexter's secret, she almost exposes something else, his unnervingly calm reaction to an ally's death. We are going to notice that she never gets close to naming him as the butcher. She does not sift through blood-slides or follow his boat into the bay. But because she has seen him vulnerable, because she has heard him talk in ways he never talks at Miami Metro Homicide, there are small, sharp moments where his mask slips in front of Deborah, in front of Rita, in front of anyone watching how tangled this triangle has become. When you lay them all out together, Leela's crimes are scattered, impulsive, almost childish compared to the grand designs of, yet she ranks above the purely external monsters because she weaponizes obsession, intimacy, and access to Dexter's private life. She burns close. Still, she sits below the true hunter Dexter has told her about his urges. But the key is what she wants. She does not want Miami Metro to see him. She wants to be the only one who truly sees him, the only person he needs. Possession, not prosecution, is the goal. Because of that, there is a hard limit on her power. Leela never finds a kill room. She never watches Dexter wrap a body in plastic or dump a bag off the slice of life. She is never in the bay when he cuts the engine, never in the shadows of a shipping yard while he cleans up. She gets the confession of a monster without any of the evidentiary scaffolding that would let her prove the Bay Harbor butcher is standing in her living room. Even her most extreme moves underline this gap. The cabin fire that kills Doakes is catastrophic, but notice where the suspicion lands. The blast radius engulfs Lila, not Dexter. Miami Metro looks at her as the unstable arsonist and, conveniently for Morgan, the convenient posthumous accomplice to Doakes. The official story hardens around them, and Dexter walks back into homicide with his mask not only intact, but reinforced by the narrative she unintentionally completes for him. That is the quiet irony of their relationship. The more unhinged she becomes, the safer his secret gets on paper. Dexter controls the flow of information with her from the start. He tells her about his dark passenger in abstract, therapeutic language. He never hands over names, dates, locations, or trophies. He lets her feel like she has pierced the armor, while he keeps the blood slides, the boat, and the code sealed off from view. So Leela can destabilize his emotional life, burn his apartment, and nearly cost him Rita and the kids. But she never becomes a true investigative threat. She does not push a file across a desk. She does not force Miami Metro to reopen a case. She does not stand over a piece of physical evidence that could put Dexter Morgan in handcuffs. In our ranking logic, that matters. This is the story of a man whose greatest danger comes from people who can touch both halves of his existence at once. Leela only ever fully grips one. And just ahead, we are going to meet the kind of villain who quietly brushes against the slides, the boat, and the badge all at the same time. So far, the people we have talked about circle Dexter like weather systems rather than searchlights. Leela storms through his life with obsession and gasoline, but when you lay them all out together, you start to see that what she holds is feeling, not evidence. She can burn his apartment, seduce him, endanger the people he cares about. She cannot walk into Miami Metro homicide and point to a single, provable thing. Others in this lower tier work the same way. Paul threatens his home life more than his freedom. Various one-off killers create public chaos that forces Dexter to move faster, lie better, improvise. They raise the temperature around him, but they do not actually have their hands on anything that links Morgan, the analyst, to the Bay Harbor butcher. Their leverage is emotional influence, or background noise in the city, not a direct line to his identity. That distinction is where our ranking quietly shifts. As we climb, we are going to spend less time with villains who just make Dexter feel exposed, and more time with the ones who could make him be exposed. People who see him at the wrong dock at the wrong hour. People who notice that his casework always seems to orbit certain bodies, no leverage, and tangible clues. They hold both at once. Trinity devastates Dexter's family while also forcing him to juggle active investigations. Jordan Chase and the Barrel Girl ring sit inside cases that pass across his microscope, turning every routine blood slide into a potential mirror. In those seasons, every moment at Miami Metro becomes a balancing act between grief, rage, and the simple practical need not to leave a fiber out of place. So as we move into the next tier, settle in, get comfortable with a different kind of threat. These are not people who love Dexter the way Leela does, or hate him with Doakes' clarity. They are neighbors, colleagues, transient monsters who, almost by accident, wander too close to the boat, the slides, the badge. They do not set out to unmask him, but they look up at exactly the wrong time and see just enough that if one more thing had gone wrong, the entire story of Dexter Morgan would have ended right there. They do not set out to unmask him, and yet they brush the edge of the truth. With Jordan Chase and the Barrel Girl ring, that edge suddenly becomes very crowded. Jordan arrives in the story wrapped in applause. A charismatic self-help guru selling empowerment to packed hotel ballrooms, his entire brand is about transformation and control. By day, he is a motivational voice in people's headphones. By night, that same voice is the command signal for a small, tightly managed circle of accomplices who abduct, torture, and murder women, leaving them in barrels that eventually wash into Miami Metro Homicide's world. This is the story of a villain who is not just one man, but an ecosystem. Jordan, Boyd Fowler, Cole Harmon, Dan Mendel, and others orbit the same secret. Victims, hotel staff, clients, security, even the people who book his seminars, all become potential witnesses without knowing it. When you lay them all out together, you start to see how unusually porous this season's threat really is. There are simply more eyes, more schedules, more travel records, more chances for someone to notice that Dexter Morgan keeps appearing at the edges. And Dexter does appear, again and again. He inserts himself into the Barrel Girl investigation as both analyst and avenger. He processes the crime scenes at the Barrel site. He interacts with Lumen, a surviving victim, who can describe the ritual in detail. He stalks Jordan's entourage, breaks into hotel rooms, tampers with evidence. Every moment he spends in that orbit increases the statistical risk that a hotel camera, a staff member, or a traumatized witness will connect the quiet blood guy from Miami Metro to the man who keeps showing up around Jordan Chase. The lines between his two lives blur in small but dangerous ways. He takes Lumen onto his boat. He moves bodies, while Miami Metro is actively building a case around the same offenders. He is there when Deborah and the task force raid sites connected to the ring, standing in rooms where, if one more piece of physical evidence had been left behind, his mask could have slipped in front of an entire unit. But that is not where Jordan's attention goes. For all his talk about seeing people's true selves, he never truly sees Dexter. His focus is inward, on self-preservation and on keeping his accomplices obedient. He senses interference, he feels pressure, but he does not forensically dissect Dexter's behavior the way when you lay them all out together. The Barrel Girl survivors feel like a chorus that never quite learns the whole song. Each woman carries a fragment, a room, a table, a smell, a voice. In those scenes where Miami Metro Homicide finally sits across from them, we are going to watch Dexter Morgan stand just off to the side, clipboard in hand, while trauma and memory tug at the edges of his mask. There is that quiet, clinical interview room where a survivor struggles to describe the men who hurt her. She remembers the ritual, the chanting of Chase's self-help language twisted into something predatory, and the way different faces came and went. It is not a neat witness statement. It is a blurred composite that could implicate Jordan, Boyd Fowler, Cole, and, by extension, anyone who keeps showing up around this case a little too often. Dexter's presence there is the real tension. By day, he is the blood guy, the harmless analyst offering gentle questions and neutral follow-ups. By night, he is already hunting the men whose names hover on the edges of these women's recollections. Every moment in those rooms is a small window, a stray glance of recognition from a survivor who glimpsed him near a van, a half-formed sentence about another man in the house, one misplaced detail, and suddenly, Morgan is not just the expert, he is part of the pattern. The risk multiplies, because this is not a solitary killer. This is the story of a ring. Jordan, Boyd, Cole, Lumen, the security staff, the handlers at his retreats, every additional accomplice is another set of eyes that might notice how often Dexter appears at the periphery. You start to see how fragile his compartmentalization really is when a traumatized witness, an overconfident accomplice, and a very involved forensic analyst all orbit the same case file. Then there is the pattern Interrupt the Season never quite cashes in on: Lumen, a survivor who not only remembers, but partners with him. She is living evidence that the Barrel Girl operation existed exactly as the victims describe, if she ever chose to talk in the wrong room to the wrong detective. The line between vigilante and suspect would collapse in a single conversation. And yet, somehow, Dexter stays just outside the blast radius. He uses Miami Metro as a shield, letting official narratives blame the dead accomplices while he quietly removes them from the board. He keeps his work with Lumen in abandoned warehouses and empty docks, never letting that blood seep onto the lab floor. The danger is there, but it is spread across too many mouths and too much pain to focus cleanly on him. That is why Jordan's arc lands in the middle of our ranking. The threat feels like static in the background, unnerving but unfocused. Next, let's move to the villains, who do what the Barrel Girls never quite manage. They take all that static and tune it directly to Dexter Morgan's frequency. That static only works while it stays in the air. The danger shifts once it starts to condense into a face sitting across from Dexter Morgan, asking ordinary questions with just a little too much interest. With someone like Jordan Chase, the violence feels outsourced. He stands on a stage, he whispers into microphones, he weaponizes other people's trauma and turns it into a self-help empire. Dexter moves through that world as an infiltrator, but there is still distance. Intimate. But that is the line we are going to cross next, because the villains who sit higher in this ranking start to close that physical and emotional distance in quiet, unnerving ways. They do not just haunt crime scenes, they drift into Dexter's social orbit. They share scenes with Debra, with Rita, with Batista, and LaGuerta, with the very people whose belief in Dexter's normalcy keeps him safe. You start to see how the margin for error shrinks the moment a killer steps over Dexter's threshold, a dinner guest who lingers a little too long in the kitchen, a colleague who walks past his desk at Miami Metro one night too late and notices that he is not where he is supposed to be, a supposed ally who earns the trust of homicide, learns the rhythms of the squad, and begins to understand how easily evidence can be bent or buried or created. This is the story of danger becoming domestic. Once a villain has eaten at Dexter's table, once they have watched him with Harrison or traded confidences with Deb, any slip in his performance is no longer an abstract risk. It is a live wire, running under every shared joke, every handshake, every late-night strategy session. And some of the strongest villains in the series are not the ones stacking the highest body counts. They are the ones who can look Dexter in the eye and, without proof, sense that something about his calm is wrong. They may not know he is the Bay Harbor butcher, but they recognize that same hum of contained violence he sees in his own reflection. So settle in, get comfortable, because the next villain on our list is not introduced as an enemy at all. He arrives as a partner, a confidant, someone who seems to understand Dexter better than anyone at Miami Metro ever has. And in doing that, he becomes a mirror and a warning sign for exactly what Dexter Morgan could turn into if he ever lets the mask slip on purpose. Miguel Prado walks into the story in daylight, a polished assistant district attorney, a man of the people, shaking hands in Miami courtrooms, while Dexter Morgan quietly processes blood in the background. On paper, they are on the same side: justice, order, consequences. But as this season unfolds, you start to see that they are not standing on the same line at all. One of them is anchored to a code. The other is slowly drifting away from it. Miguel is the first major antagonist who does not begin as an antagonist. He begins as a friend. He and Dexter bond over a shared frustration with the limits of the legal system, over killers who walk free on technicalities while Miami Metro Homicide has to shrug and move on. And this is where the danger starts to feel different, because we're going to watch Dexter do something he almost never does with outsiders. He lets Miguel in. Not all the way. Not into the childhood trauma or the Bay Harbor butcher investigation, but far enough. Dexter shows him the code. He explains the rules, the ritual, the way Harry shaped this private system of justice. Miguel does not just hear about it in theory, he participates. He stands on a kill site. He watches the plastic go up. He helps remove someone from the world. And in that moment, a line that had always separated Dexter's night from his day life is blurred by a man who works inside the courthouse. The problem is that Miguel does not want a code. He wants permission. Once he understands enough of Dexter's method to code, he knows the broad shape of the ritual, and he holds a public office that gives weight to every word he might say if he ever decided to turn on his new friend. When you lay them all out together, Miguel's scenes feel like watching a hand hover at the edge of Dexter's disguise. He stands at the threshold, fingers on the fabric, testing how far he can pull without tearing everything. That is why he ranks higher than the earlier, more external threats. Because this is the story of a man who almost became Dexter's sanctioned twin, and of how close that came to collapsing the illusion that the next villain on our list will start to probe even harder. And then we watch what happens when the student steps into the classroom and tries to take over the lesson. Miguel does not just hear about Dexter's ritual, he stands in it. Plastic on the walls, tools laid out, the air in that abandoned room in Miami humming with a kind of rehearsed quiet. For the first time in the series, Dexter Morgan invites someone else to stand inside the circle instead of on the table. The first kill they share, with Miguel in the apron, is almost a rehearsal of Dexter's entire secret life. The photos, the confrontation, the confession, forced out under bright plastic and a single, unforgiving light. On the surface, it is a triumph of mentorship. Underneath, every moment is a risk. Miguel is loud, emotional, vibrating with anger where Dexter is controlled. You start to see how easily raised voices, a stray footprint, or a neighbor hearing something through a thin wall could have turned this into a homicide scene that Miami Metro would eventually trace back to the Bay Harbor Butcher's familiar staging. Because Miguel does not really want the code. He wants permission. When he goes after Ellen Wolf, a defense attorney who does not meet Dexter's standards, the mask slips. No research, no airtight proof, no careful disposal, just a powerful prosecutor acting on a grudge. And suddenly there is a missing high-profile lawyer, a volatile public feud, and a husband who cannot quite explain where he was. When you lay them all out together, those choices form a pattern of impulsive violence that points not just to Miguel, but to the method he has borrowed. This is where the danger spreads outward. Sylvia Prado, watching her husband's temper spike and his late nights multiply, starts to feel that something is fundamentally wrong. Ramon, already unstable, fixates on answers and begins digging in directions that brush uncomfortably close to both Miguel's secrets and Dexter's. They do not have the full picture, but they have enough fragments, strange bruises, erratic behavior, whispered arguments. With 2 or 3 more concrete clues, the line from Miguel's new darkness to the quiet blood analyst who befriended him might have started to come into focus. There is a moment, almost a pattern interrupt in the season's story, when Dexter realizes he has created a variable he cannot control. The student is improvising. Now, Dexter is trapped in a narrow corridor of options. He has to put Miguel on a table that Miguel already understands, in a kill room that cannot look like his, in a city where Miami Metro Homicide is already circling the Ellen Wolf case. It has to read as another tragic, explainable death, not as the silencing of a man who knows far too much. Settle in, get comfortable with what that means. Miguel's arc is not just the whole ritual, not at first. He talks about the code, about rules, about only going after people who deserve it. He frames it as ethics, as a dark kind of mentorship, as if by controlling the language, he can control the danger. This is the story of a man who believes that partial honesty is safer than total denial, that if he chooses what Miguel sees, the mask will remain intact. But that is its own kind of illusion, because every time Dexter lifts the mask even a fraction, he is not just sharing a secret, he is creating a new potential witness. Miguel now knows there is a code. He knows there is a process. He knows that when Morgan disappears into the night, something violent and deliberate happens. If Miguel had ever been cornered, arrested, or simply humiliated. There is a version of this season where he points a shaking hand back toward Dexter and says, "Ask him about his rules." When you lay them all out together, these moments of partial revelation start to look less like isolated risks and more like a spreading network of possible exposure. Brian knew Dexter's origin. Leela saw his addiction to killing. Miguel learns the structure, the language, the quasi-moral framework. You start to see that every confidant, every almost ally, adds another line on the map that an investigator could one day follow. There is also a quieter cost. Teaching Miguel forces Dexter to confront the possibility that he is not unique. If someone like Miguel can take the code, twist it, and use it to justify his own impulses, then the code is not a sacred boundary. It is a mask that can be worn by anyone. That realization shakes Dexter more than he admits. It means his careful separation between monster with rules and monster without them is thinner than he thought, and that the thing protecting him can be corrupted from the inside. And Miguel's arc is a rehearsal for something worse. We are going to move into seasons where the villains do not just glimpse the code, they trace it back to the man, to the boat, to the blood slide, to the trail through Miami that Morgan thought he had washed clean. Settle in, get comfortable, because the next people who get close do not want to be taught. They want to hunt. They turn the mask itself into a target, and every lesson Dexter thought would keep him safe becomes one more clue someone can use to finally pull it off. And in the middle of all of that hunting, the danger shifts somewhere quieter, somewhere fluorescent, and supposedly safe. The next threat is not stalking the docks or the back alleys of Miami. He is walking the same sterile corridors where Dexter and Debra go to patch themselves back together. This is the brain surgeon, and his operating room is the hospital itself. On paper, he is almost clinical. A meticulous killer who removes pieces of brain tissue, stages bodies with surgical precision, and leaves grisly calling cards that practically beg Miami Metro Homicide to pay attention. Every scene is designed to be seen. Every wound is a message. So of course, Dexter is drawn in professionally, reading the blood, reconstructing the violence, and of course, Debra cannot escape it either, because the bodies and the trauma keep circling the same medical spaces she is already using to manage her own unraveling. But that is where the threat deepens. This is not just another predator in the city. This is someone whose proximity to Debra, to her guilt over LaGuerta, to her fragile hold-on Sabraf, all of them potential witnesses who might remember the wrong face at the wrong moment. The margin for error narrows, not because the villain is omniscient, but because the setting itself refuses to look away. When you lay them all out together, the brain surgeon's scenes show a pattern. He never quite pulls Dexter's mask off, never assembles the full Bay Harbor butcher story. But his presence tightens the net around both siblings. Debra's therapy sessions, her confessions, her hospitalizations, all generate paper trails and memories that other people could connect later. Dexter's visits, his interest, his proximity to a killer stalking the same building leave faint fingerprints on the narrative even when he thinks he has wiped every physical surface clean. You start to see why he ranks above some of the earlier villains. The body count may be smaller, the theatrics less grand than Trinity's, but the overlap zones are more intimate. This is the story of a threat that lives exactly where Dexter's personal and professional lives collide, where his need to protect Debra and his need to keep killing occupy the same fluorescent hallway. He stops short of naming Dexter as a monster, but he moves the hunt into a place where the next villain will not have to guess quite so hard. Now, let's stay in that hospital light a little longer, because the cost of that proximity is about to become permanent. We stay in that cold, humming hospital light, and the shape that finally steps out of the shadows is not Vogel, not a faceless brain surgeon, but Oliver Saxon. This is the story of the moment the case file stops being abstract and turns, very quietly, into a man who is looking back at Dexter and... On paper, Saxon is just another name moving through Miami Metro Homicide, another relative to be interviewed, another face you could pass in a hallway and forget. But when you lay them all out together, the details start to tighten. The surgical precision, the selective trophies, the way the brain surgeon seems to anticipate not only the investigation, but Dexter Morgan himself. The reveal that Saxon is Vogel's son snaps the pattern into focus. He is not killing at random. He is circling a family that now includes Dexter and, by extension, Debra. What makes Saxon feel especially dangerous is how comfortably he moves through their world before anyone truly clocks him. He walks into the hospital, he talks to staff, he brushes past Deborah. He sits across from Miami Metro without the immediate suspicion that followed someone like Doakes. The mask he wears is bland, almost aggressively normal, and that is exactly why he can stand so close to the real threat without raising alarms. For Dexter, that proximity forces risk. There is the moment he manipulates evidence at a brain surgeon scene, shaving off time, cutting corners. Because the killer is watching, and the walls of procedure feel too slow. There is the rushed body move, the late-night stalking through hospital corridors, the improvised confrontation in Saxon's apartment, where one wrong angle, one neighbor with a camera phone, would have put Morgan on the wrong side of a crime scene. Every close call, every near miss, every time the mask almost comes off is amplified because Saxon is already inside their orbit. And then Saxon does what separates a mid-tier villain from a high-tier threat. He goes directly at Deborah. He shoots her in a crowdable tragedy. Now, let's follow that crack as it runs out of the hospital and into the storm, because the next threat will not be content to stay in the shadows at all. That crack runs straight into fluorescent light, into polished floors, rolling gurneys, and cameras quietly watching from every corner of the ICU. This is the part of the story where Dexter Morgan is no longer slipping into abandoned buildings or plastic-wrapped kill rooms. He is stalking a serial killer in a place explicitly designed to notice and record every movement. We are going to sit with those hospital sequences for a moment, because when you lay them all out together, you start to see how thin the line becomes. Dexter moves through those corridors as a blood analyst, a concerned brother, a supposed protector of Miami Metro homicide. But in his head, he is measuring angles, blind spots, and how long it would take to drag Oliver Saxon into an empty room before anyone looks up from a chart. There is the night walk, for instance. Dexter trailing Saxon past nurses' stations, timing his steps with the squeak of a cart, ducking just outside the sweep of a camera. It looks, on the surface, like a worried relative checking in on a patient. But every small improvisation around a security camera, every decision to take a back stairwell instead of the elevator, is one more chance for a staff member to notice that this man from forensics is always here when something is wrong. And the show quietly underlines that risk. Badge swipes, visitor logs, surveillance footage that can be replayed later by anyone who starts to wonder why Dexter is in restricted areas after hours. There are moments where he's caught in heated exchanges with Saxon that do not match his official role at all. Moments where a nurse glances over or a guard radios in, and you feel that if one person decides to file a report, the mask tears a little. Then the pattern interrupts. Saxon stops being the prey, who does not know he is being hunted. He notices the tail. He studies the same cameras, the same blind corners, and suddenly the cat and mouse routine becomes a mutual pursuit that has to stay just below the threshold of a full police response. Dexter cannot drag him to a kill room without creating a missing suspect in an active Miami Metro homicide case. Saxon cannot strike openly without inviting every cop in the building. So both men operate in this narrow, dangerous space, pretending to be calm while they test the limits of hospital security. This is the story of a villain who does not just threaten Dexter's body, but the structure that has always kept him safe, by forcing Morgan to hunt in a place built to document everything. Saxon earns his place near the top of the ranking and points us toward the final escalation, where even the best improvisation will not be enough. By the time we reach the brain surgeon and Oliver Saxon, something quiet has changed in the air around Dexter Morgan. The danger is no longer just a figure in a warehouse or a shadow on a dock. It is in the walls, in the cameras, in the paperwork, in every place that used to feel invisible. Earlier in the series, Each villain mostly threatened Dexter alone. Brian knew the truth, but treated Deborah as leverage. Miguel endangered the code, but not the institution around it. Even Trinity, as devastating as he was, still allowed Dexter to imagine a separation between Laguerta's suspicions after years of high-profile cases. Every institution around them is already on edge. Any misstep by Morgan is now logged, time-stamped, and backed up on a server he cannot reach with a trash bag. And Deborah is not on the outside anymore. She knows. Her knowledge of Dexter's secret, layered over her own trauma and guilt, means she walks into every homicide briefing as both witness and accomplice. When she interviews a nurse about Saxon, when she reviews a security feed that might contain Dexter in the background, the risk is not just that someone will see him. The risk is that someone will see them together, will notice the pattern of shared disappearances, overlapping cases, synchronized bad luck. This is the story of systemic blindness, turning into systemic suspicion. For years, the same structures that protected Dexter did so by not really looking at him. A friendly blood spatter analyst who brings donuts, solves cases, and stays late is the last person anyone wants to question. But when you lay them all out together, the Bay Harbor butcher investigation, Laguerta's death, the brain surgeon's connection to Vogel, Saxon stalking hospital corridors, you start to see a network that has stopped giving Dexter the benefit of the doubt. Now, let's look ahead for a moment. The remaining villains in this ranking do not just move inside that tightening net, they pull on it. They weaponize the institutions, the relationships, the long memory of Miami Metro itself. Settle in, get comfortable, because from here on, every new threat is not just a killer in Dexter's path, but a hand tugging the whole system closer to finally seeing what has been in front of it the entire time. And no one pulls harder on that net than the man who never needed it in the first place. Brian Moser does not have to follow clues, connect fibers, or question witnesses. He begins where every other villain is desperately trying to end up, with the whole truth about Dexter Morgan. This is the story of the Ice Truck Killer as not just a mystery from Season 1, but as a brother who already lives on the other side of Dexter's mask. Brian and Dexter share the same shipping container, the same river of blood, the same childhood memory carved into them before they had language for it. When you lay them all out together, every body he leaves, every limb, every doll part, you start to see that he is not taunting Miami Metro homicide. He is talking directly to Dexter. Most threats in this series have to work their way inward. They suspect. They infer. They get close and then closer. Brian skips all of that. He knows. He knows Dexter kills. He knows the ritual, the urge, the quiet satisfaction that follows. And instead of recoiling from it, he embraces it like a family heirloom finally returned to its rightful owner. So his crime scenes are not puzzles for the task force. They are letters to his brother. The bloodless bodies, the carefully posed corpses, the chopped and arranged remains, the hand delivered to Dexter's freezer, the mannequin parts left in his apartment, each one is a private conversation, conducted in public. We are going to watch detectives argue over tire tracks and timelines, while the real dialogue is happening in a language only two people on Earth can read. That is what makes Brian's threat feel so unusual. On paper, he is a serial killer moving through Miami. In practice, he is bypassing the entire investigative system, using someone holding the deepest possible knowledge of who he is and choosing to weaponize it emotionally instead. Brian sits near the very top of this ranking. Now, let's move to the villains who combine that intimate understanding with a far colder interest in evidence, reputation, and the law itself. If Brian's knowledge of Dexter is the emotional apex, his crime scenes are the practical proof of how dangerous that knowledge really is. From the very first dismembered body, laid out in neat, bloodless pieces, we are going to see a killer staging not just murders, but conversations. Every tableau is a message. Every missing drop of blood is a reference. Every clean cut is a mirror held up to Morgan's own methods. The ice truck killer's displays are strangely polite. Limbs are wrapped, posed, refrigerated. Blood is drained so thoroughly that Miami Metro Homicide stands in rooms where unspeakable violence has occurred and sees almost nothing. For everyone else, it is a puzzle about procedure and access. For Dexter, it is a deeply personal language. The precision, the care, the absence of splatter on the walls all echo his own ritual, his own insistence on control. When you lay them all out together, you start to see that Brian is effectively recreating Dexter's inner world in public spaces. This is the story of a killer who leaves clues that only his brother can fully read, but who also leaves them right under the department's fluorescent lights. The Barbie doll left on Dexter's fridge, the severed fingertips painted different colors, the body parts arranged at locations from Dexter's childhood, each one pulls a visible reaction out of him. He pauses too long. He recognizes the pattern a little too quickly. The others see a gifted analyst connecting dots. We see a man trying not to flinch at his own reflection. There are moments where that mask almost slips. When Dexter walks into a crime scene and feels a flash of recognition before he can compose the proper horror. When he stands over the chopped-up remains on the ice rink and looks more fascinated than disturbed. His calm becomes its own kind of tell. In a room full of detectives unnerved by a bloodless body, he looks at home. If anyone at Miami Metro had been watching Dexter, rather than just the evidence, the line between analyst and accomplice might have started to blur. Brian increases the risk when he pulls Deborah into the game. Dating her, proposing to her, planning a wedding that is really an abduction, he is weaving a triangle so tight it almost cannot hold. Deb's profile of the ice truck killer ends up describing Dexter with eerie accuracy, and she does it sitting across from him at her desk. Her boyfriend is the serial killer. Her brother is the intended partner. All of it unfolds in the middle of the squad. It would not have taken much. One detective noticing Dexter's oddly muted panic when Deb goes missing. One supervisor asking why this particular case seems to follow him home. Brian is playing too close to home on purpose, testing how much exposure Dexter's life can take before it breaks. And the unsettling part is how much it can take. Because if a killer this intimate cannot quite push him into the open, the question becomes who or what possibly could next. Brian is the first villain who does more than circle Dexter's life from the outside. He steps directly into the middle to kill Brian. But that is not the whole story. Because when you lay them all out together, every frame in that scene is about the mask. If Dexter walks away with Brian, he abandons Miami Metro, the donuts, the blood reports, the small talk at homicide. He chooses a life where the code is optional, and the night finally swallows the day persona whole. By cutting Brian's throat instead, Dexter is choosing the mask. He is choosing the suburban routine with Rita, the job that keeps him close to evidence, the carefully engineered distance from everyone at Miami Metro. He is choosing to keep lying to Deborah even as he saves her. Preserving their bond as a kind of fragile cover story he will spend the rest of the series defending. On paper, it looks like a victory. The serial killer brother is removed, the secret is preserved, the department never knows how close one of their own came to being carved up on a table. But it is also a warning. In that moment, Dexter proves something dangerous to himself. If someone knows too much, even someone who shares his blood, he can put them on the table and make the problem disappear. This is the story of a precedent. After Brian, you start to see Dexter become more careful about who gets near the real him, and more ruthless when they do. Miguel Prado, who wants to turn the code into a partnership. Leela, who falls in love with the darkness instead of the disguise. Oliver Saxon, who studies Dexter the way Dexter studies his own victims. Now, let's notice the pattern. Each one gets closer to the truth, and each one ends up as a cleanup job. Settle in, get comfortable, because that pattern will not hold forever. We are going to watch, season by season, as the villains get stronger, not just in body count, but in how deeply they cut into Dexter's life. And somewhere ahead in this ranking is the one opponent who finally breaks the rule Brian helped create, forcing Dexter into a choice he cannot solve, with plastic sheeting and a knife. And that brings us to the villain who quietly rewrites the scale we are using. Up to this point in the series, Dexter's enemies have threatened his freedom, his code, his sense of self. With Arthur Mitchell, the Trinity Killer, the danger steps over a different line. It walks through the front door, wipes its feet, and smiles at the kids. On the surface, Arthur is almost aggressively ordinary. He is a soft-spoken church deacon, a man who organizes charity builds, a husband and father who blends into the background of suburban life so completely that you start to see how he has been doing this for decades. Behind that mask of routine and community service is a ritualistic killer with a pattern so meticulous it spans states, identities, and generations without ever touching Miami Metro's radar. Every cycle is the same: the bludgeoned man, the woman in the bathtub, the staged jump. A private liturgy of violence, hidden in plain sight. When Dexter first studies him, he does not see a monster to destroy. He sees a blueprint. Arthur appears to be everything Dexter Morgan has been trying to become: a man who can maintain a family, perform normalcy, and still feed the darkness on schedule. This is the story of Dexter mistaking survival for success. He believes Arthur has solved the equation Harry never could, that Trinity is living proof you can have the house, the spouse, Arthur into his world, into his name, even into his home. He lets this man meet Rita. He lets him stand in the same rooms where his children sleep. What began as an investigation quietly shifts into an invasion, and we are going to watch as Dexter's safest space becomes a hunting ground he does not control. The irony is almost cruel. In trying to learn how to protect his family and his mask, he escorts the most dangerous person he has ever met straight to them. That is why Trinity ranks near the very top of any list of Dexter villains. Not just because of his body count, which is staggering, but because of how deeply he penetrates the illusion of safety Dexter has built. Arthur does not merely threaten to expose the Bay Harbor butcher to Miami Metro homicide. He exposes the fantasy that Dexter can kill forever and still keep his loved ones untouched. Now, let's stay with Arthur a little longer and watch what happens when that fantasy finally shatters. Arthur does something no other seasoned villain quite manages. He doesn't just haunt the edges of Dexter Morgan's life. He pours himself a cup of coffee in Dexter's kitchen and asks about the kids' homework. We're going to stay in those quiet domestic scenes for a moment, because that is where his strength as a threat really settles in. On the surface, those breakfasts are calm. Arthur at the table, Rita smiling politely, Astor and Cody moving around the room the way children do when they're half distracted and half curious about the new adult in their space. The light is soft, the conversation ordinary. But underneath, there is this sense that a line has been crossed, that the mask Dexter wears at home has been quietly, almost politely invaded. Trinity is not stalking from the shadows. He is passing the orange juice. Every interaction between Arthur and Dexter's family becomes a possible point of exposure. A stray comment about Dexter's schedule, a slightly off reaction when someone mentions Miami Metro homicide, a look that lingers a second too long on a news report about the Trinity Killer. Any of those small, forgettable moments could, if noticed, unravel the story Dexter has so carefully told about himself. You start to see how fragile that story is when a man who shares his secret nature is sitting 3 feet away from his children. But that is not the whole story, because Dexter is not just hosting Arthur, he is studying him. He is juggling the Mitchells and the Morgans, lying to Rita about work, disappearing at odd hours, trying to track a serial killer while simultaneously playing the role of helpful neighbor and family man. Every time he leaves one breakfast table for another, the risk compounds. One missed school event, one contradictory excuse, one careless overlap between his two calendars. And someone could finally notice that Dexter Morgan's life does not quite add up. Arthur's own family only deepens that danger. When Dexter visits the Mitchell house, what he finds is a distorted mirror of what he tells himself he wants: a long marriage, grown children, a stable home. This is the story of a man looking at his possible future and seeing both aspiration and horror. That emotional turbulence makes him sloppy. He empathizes, he interferes, he pushes Arthur's son and wife in ways that are less calculated and more reactive, and that instability follows him back to his own living room. When you lay them all out together in the bathtub is not just another Trinity kill. It is the moment the pattern we have been studying for an entire season crosses the last possible line and sinks its teeth directly into Dexter Morgan's private life. We're going to sit with that image for a second. The blood spreading through the water, the tiles, the stillness of Rita's face. This is not a crime scene at a stranger's house, or a tableau that Miami Metro Homicide will process and then leave behind. This is Trinity taking his well-established ritual and deliberately installing it inside Dexter's supposed sanctuary, as if to say that the story of Arthur Mitchell was always going to end here, in Dexter's bathroom. But the real exposure is not legal. Not yet. What Trinity does in that bathtub is strip away Dexter's illusion that he can quarantine his darkness from his family. The message is simple and devastating. Your double life has a bill, and you do not get to choose who pays it. When you lay them all out together, every earlier close call, every time Dexter thought he had contained the threat, you start to see how naive that belief really was. And then there is Harrison, sitting in a pool of blood on the floor, crying, framed almost exactly the way young Dexter was found in his mother's shipping container. It is an eerie, deliberate echo, a pattern interrupt in the series itself. For a second, the camera is not just showing you a tragedy, it is showing you a cycle. If anyone in Miami Metro had been willing to step back and compare those two origin scenes, to ask why violence keeps orbiting this one analyst, the investigative parallels could have become impossible to ignore. On paper, though, Dexter survives. Miami Metro does not immediately connect him to Trinity's final act. There is no sudden warrant, no interrogation that corners him in an evidence room. But that absence of handcuffs is almost misleading, because the emotional and narrative impact is so severe that it permanently alters Dexter's behavior. His judgment, his risk profile. From this point on, every decision is colored by grief, by guilt, by a quiet, frantic need to believe that he can still protect what is left. This is the story of a villain whose strength is measured less in body count and more in how thoroughly he destroys the mask. Trinity does not expose Dexter to the courts. He exposes him to himself. He proves that control was always an illusion, that the lines Dexter drew between hunter and husband were made of paper. And by shattering that barrier, Arthur Mitchell leaves Dexter more fragile, more volatile, and therefore more vulnerable to future exposure than ever before. Now let's see how the villains that follow end up walking through the cracks Trinity left behind. Trinity shatters Dexter's illusion of control, but what might be even more unsettling is what survives him. The blood is still wet on Rita's bathroom tiles. A serial killer's full pattern has just been mapped out for the world, and yet the system that should be at its sharpest remains strangely, almost comfortingly, blind. Miami Metro homicide finally gets its monster. Arthur Mitchell's name goes up on the board, his victims are cataloged, his travel history pinned into neat, colored lines. We're going to watch the detectives do what they do best: reconstruct a life through dates, bodies, and crime scenes. And in that very competence, this is the story of how praise can be just as protective as evidence. The closer Dexter gets to Arthur, the easier it becomes to explain away anything strange as dedication. His sudden obsession with renovation charities, his presence near key locations, even his emotional volatility in those final days, all get folded into a narrative of a forensic analyst who cared too much. The mask holds, not because it is flawless, but because everyone prefers the version where he is one of the good ones. Rita's death should be the rupture. A Trinity-style kill in Dexter's own home, timed almost perfectly with Arthur's exposure and downfall. When you lay them all out together, the coincidences start to feel less like chance and more like a pattern drawn in red. But the investigation into her murder never quite walks that line. It accepts the simplest connection: Trinity found her through Dexter. No one asks why this particular serial killer managed to orbit so close to Morgan without burning him. And so the series-wide pattern continues. Again and again, institutions collect fragments of the truth, stack them in folders, write them into reports, and still fail to assemble the one picture that matters: Dexter at the center, quietly shaping the chaos around. The Bay Harbor butcher case, the ice truck killer, now Trinity. Each file brushes his shadow, then turns away. Settle in, get comfortable, because that blindness is not permanent. The strongest villains left in our ranking are the ones who either finally pierce that institutional haze or learn to weaponize it, turning the very systems that once protected Dexter into traps that leave him with nowhere left to hide. And if the institution usually turns away, Sergeant James Doakes is the moment the institution actually looks back. He is the first person inside Miami Metro homicide who looks at Dexter Morgan, watches the polite smile and the donut routine, and simply does not believe a word of it. From almost his first scene, Doakes is a disruption in the rhythm. Everyone else treats Dexter like harmless background noise, a convenient expert who makes their cases cleaner. Doakes walks past the same lab benches, hears the same jokes, and instead of seeing a helpful analyst, he sees a predator standing in the middle of the squad room. No big revelation, no secret file, just a man with instincts honed by combat and years of chasing violent people. That is what makes him so dangerous. Doakes does not need elaborate clues or a perfect profile to get there. He watches the way Dexter's eyes stay just a little too calm at blood-soaked scenes. He notices how Morgan is always a step too interested in the worst killings, how his body language never quite matches the horror in front of him. He knows what real violence looks like when it has left a mark on someone, and when you lay them all out together, every quiet tell, every off-key reaction, you start to see why he cannot let it go. So he acts on it. Doakes tails Dexter after hours, follows him to suspicious locations, checks his rental cars and his marina, turns up in parking lots where Dexter thought he was alone. Those scenes where Dexter is forced to abort a hunt because Doakes is suddenly in the rearview mirror are some of the earliest, sharpest near-exposure moments in the series. A trunk that cannot be opened. A kill room that has to be dismantled in seconds. A coarse institutional suspicion is why we are going to keep him in the absolute top tier of threats, even though he never gets the final proof. Because if Leela had not intervened at that cabin, if the Bay Harbor butcher case had broken just a little differently, the next scene might have been Dexter Morgan in handcuffs. And Doakes is only the beginning of what happens when people on the inside start to truly see him. So to see how close that almost came true, we are going to step inside the place where Doakes finally catches Dexter with the mask off. Not in a conference room at Miami Metro, not in front of the whole homicide squad, but in a quiet cabin in the Everglades, where every safeguard Dexter relied on stops working. It starts with something small, a wooden box, a collection of glass slides that, to anyone else, might look like a strange lab habit. But when Doakes breaks into Dexter's apartment and finds that hidden case, when he holds those slides up to the light and realizes each one is a preserved drop of victim blood, you start to see the line between suspicion and proof snap into focus. This is not just a weird coworker anymore. This is a serial killer cataloging his work. From there, the trail leads out of the city. Doakes tails Morgan, follows him away from Miami's neon and into the swamp, tracking the man he has been side-eyeing since season 1 to a remote cabin that should not matter. And then he walks in on the one thing Dexter never intended anyone at Metro to see: a kill room in progress. The plastic, the tools, the victim, and Dexter standing in the middle of it all. There is no clever explanation for this scene. There is no joke about donuts that can make it go away. The decision that follows is one of the strangest turns in Dexter's story. He does not kill Doakes on the spot, even though the code and basic self-preservation both point in that direction. Instead, he knocks him out and locks him in a cage inside the cabin. A colleague, a cop, the first person in the series who truly knows what he is, reduced to a prisoner that Dexter feeds, argues with, and tries to reason into silence. It is desperate, and it is oddly hopeful, as if Dexter is testing whether some kind of confession without consequences might be possible. Those cabin scenes play like a pressure cooker. Doakes demanding explanations, calling him a psychopath, insisting that the only way out is to turn himself in. Dexter pacing, circling, coming right up to the edge of saying everything. The childhood trauma, Harry's code, the list of names behind those slides. And under all of it, a ticking clock. How long can a secret prison, a caged sergeant, and a blood-soaked cabin stay off the radar when the entire Bay Harbor Butcher task force is combing the area? Here is the pattern interrupt. The threat is no longer a clue at a crime scene or a slip of the tongue in the lab. The threat is geography. If anyone from Miami Metro stumbles onto that property, they do not just find Doakes. They find the slides, the plastic, the tools. The literal embodiment of the FBI profile that already points to a forensically skilled insider with a boat. When you lay them all out together, the cabin, the cage, and Doakes' confirmed knowledge form a single powder keg. This is the story of a near miss so complete, and by walking into a space she was never meant to see. She trails him, slips through the trees, and discovers the cabin by the swamp. Inside, she finds Doakes caged. The plastic sheeting, the tools, the unmistakable outline of a kill room. In one quiet sweep of her eyes, the story Dexter has worked so hard to hide is suddenly real to her. But that is not the choice that matters. The choice that matters is what she does with it. Instead of freeing Doakes and going to Miami Metro homicide, instead of shattering Dexter's mask in the most direct, procedural way possible, she decides to burn it all down. Literally, she douses the place in fuel, locks Doakes inside, and lights the match. The explosion kills the one man who has actually caught Morgan, and it vaporizes the blood slides and equipment that tie the Bay Harbor Butcher case to Dexter's hands. When you lay them all out together, the steps are almost absurd. A volatile arsonist, who was at best a mid-ear threat to Dexter's emotional stability, becomes, in one grotesque moment, his guardian angel. Leela thinks she is saving the man she loves from a monster. In reality, she is saving the monster from the man who tried to stop him. You start to see the dark irony the series keeps returning to. The people who feel the most for Dexter are often the ones who protect him from the people who see him most clearly. This is the story of Doakes' greatest victory being rewritten as his downfall. Once the cabin is ash and smoke, the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation suddenly has a body, a narrative, and a clean ending. The blood slides are there, the cabin is there, the suspect is an already unstable sergeant who has been openly hostile to Dexter for an entire season. The FBI and Miami Metro can pin everything on Doakes, close the file, and move on. The only man who understood what Dexter was becomes a convenient scapegoat, reduced to a cautionary tale about cops who go too far. Now, let's sit with what that says about the institution around him. LaGuardia's face never fully relaxes. A few colleagues hesitate. The solution feels almost too neat, but the system prefers a tidy answer over a messy truth, a dead suspect over a living question mark. The case is officially solved, and in that official space, doubt has no paperwork. And so the Doakes-Leela cabin triangle becomes one of the purest expressions of the show's central tension. Dexter almost loses everything. His mask is off, his code is exposed, his double life is hanging by a thread. Then chaos, obsession, and human error collide at the last possible moment and turn catastrophe into cover. As we are going to see with other villains, the closer he gets to justice, the more the universe itself seems to tilt just enough to let him slip away. And sometimes, the universe does not need to tilt at all. Sometimes the most dangerous person in Dexter Morgan's life is not a serial killer in the shadows, but the woman who has been walking beside him into Miami Metro homicide every single morning. Debra Morgan is not just Dexter's sister. She is a decorated detective whose entire sense of self is wrapped around catching killers, following procedure, and believing that the system, if you push hard enough, will give you justice. This is the story of someone who builds her identity on the idea that monsters are out there, and that she is the one who finds them, files the paperwork. Once she knows, she can connect Dexter to case files, to timelines, to missing suspects. She has access to the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation history, to LaGuardia's old suspicions, to colleagues who trust her implicitly. When you lay them all out together, you start to see how uniquely dangerous that combination is. She does not need to break into a database or steal evidence. She is the database. She is the chain of custody. From that point on, every moment between them is a potential confession, a potential arrest report that has not been written yet. Deborah is torn between the little girl who worshipped her big brother and the lieutenant who is supposed to put the Bay Harbor Butcher in hand. We watch her oscillate, ordering Dexter to stop, then covering up the evidence, following LaGuardia's trail, then pulling the trigger to protect him. It is a prolonged, unstable state, where one bad night, one relapse, one argument could send her straight to internal affairs. There is a dry irony here. So many villains spend entire seasons trying to unmask Dexter, and the person who poses the greatest personal threat is the one who already loves him, already has his house keys, already sits across from him at family dinners. She does not need to expose him to hurt him. All she has to do is tell the truth. That is why, in terms of personal threat, Deborah sits at the very top. She holds both the emotional power to shatter Dexter's world and the procedural power to end his freedom at any moment. And as we are going to see with the next adversary, when that kind of knowledge is paired with someone who is not conflicted at all, the danger changes shape in a way Dexter cannot charm his way out of. And that danger becomes something else entirely the night Deborah opens the church door. We are going to slow that moment down, because when you lay them all out together, every close call, every near miss, this is the one where the mask does not almost slip. It comes off in a single, clean motion. The tableau is simple and brutal. Dexter Morgan in his kill clothes, Travis Marshall wrapped in plastic on the altar, a knife poised mid-arc. Candlelight, blood, and the sister who has trusted him more than anyone standing in the doorway, unable to breathe. Up to this point in the series, Dexter has lived in a careful partition. Daylight in Miami Metro homicide, running blood spatter for Deb and LaGuerta. Nighttime in abandoned buildings and on isolated boats, following the code. But when Deborah sees him bring that knife down into Travis, the line between those worlds is not blurred, it is erased. She does not catch a suspicious text or a strange alibi. She witnesses the kill itself. There is no procedural buffer, no room for doubt. The drive away from the church is strangely quiet. That is the pattern interrupt. No screaming argument, no immediate arrest. Just Deborah gripping the steering wheel, glancing over at Dexter as if he has been body snatched, while he tries to assemble a version of the truth that she can survive hearing. You start to see how the dynamic of the show tilts in that silence. From here on, Dexter's secret is no longer an internal monologue. It is a shared burden, riding in the passenger seat. In the immediate aftermath, Deborah cycles through shock and denial in real time, while still walking into Miami Metro every morning. She orders Dexter into therapy. She tries to frame what she saw as annotated with questions that point directly to Dexter. On a bad day, she could simply decide she cannot live with this and walk into an IA office. No investigation required. Because that is what makes Deborah's knowledge more dangerous than any external villain's suspicion. Doakes, LaGuerta, even Trinity had to infer, to circle, to test theories against limited data. Deborah has the answer key. She has seen Dexter kill, heard him admit what he is, watched him justify it. From this point forward, the real suspense is not whether someone will connect the dots, but whether the one person who already has will choose to act on what she knows. And as we move into adversaries who never loved Dexter at all, that difference becomes the thin line between tension and total collapse. Deborah is not a villain in the way Trinity or Saxon are, but from this point in the story, she becomes something stranger and more dangerous, a living fault line running directly through Dexter's life. She is the person who loves him most, and the person who now knows the most. And every moment she spends trying to live with that knowledge is another moment his mask might slip in front of Miami Metro homicide. We are going to sit with that descent for a bit, because when you lay them all out together, her choices form the longest, slowest, near miss in the entire series. It starts with a single night in a shipping container. She sees Dexter kill Travis Marshall, hears him say it was necessary, and decides, in shock, to believe him. But that decision does not stay clean. It curdles. It turns into therapy sessions where she circles the truth, into late-night drinking where the words almost spill out, into mornings where she walks into the station already shaking. Deborah's emotional collapse is not sudden. It is incremental. A pill here, a drink there, an outburst at work that goes just a little too far. She moves from the driven, foul-mouthed detective we met in Season 1 to someone who cannot trust her own instincts, because her instincts tell her that her brother, the man she has defended to everyone, is a serial killer. So she overcorrects. She throws herself into cases. She interrogates suspects too hard. She second-guesses every call she makes, because if she could be wrong about Dexter Morgan, what else is she wrong about? Every crack in that composure is a potential leak in his secret. A therapist who hears too much about someone she can't turn in. A drunken argument at a bar where Dexter's name comes up one too many times, an interrogation where she projects her rage at him onto the wrong suspect and says just a little too much about how killers think. The threat is not that Deborah will march into internal affairs with a file. It is that her pain will find its own path to the surface. Dexter sees this, and in typical Dexter fashion, tries to manage it. He coaches her on what to say. He withholds details he thinks will hurt her. He makes unilateral decisions about who lives and who dies, then expects her to accept the aftermath. But control is a blunt instrument here. The more he steers, the more she resents him. The more he hides, the more unstable she becomes. You start to see that every attempt to protect Deborah is also an attempt to protect himself, and the two motives cannot be separated. All of this plays out inside Miami Metro, which keeps the tension humming. Deborah is now the lieutenant, walking daily past evidence lockers, old files, and Dexter's world, rather than legally revealing it. And as we move toward the adversaries, who weaponize institutions and public narratives, Deborah's long unraveling becomes the quiet template for how dangerous it is when someone truly sees him and still stays. Deborah's choice is the emotional crack that never quite becomes a public explosion. Kurt Caldwell is what happens when that same crack appears, in a place where Dexter no longer controls the room, the narrative, or even his own last name. In New Blood, we're going to watch Dexter Morgan walk into a different kind of danger. No Miami skyline, no Metro homicide bullpen. No familiar colleagues whose blind spots he has already mapped. Instead, we get Jim Lindsay, the quiet clerk at a small town shop in Iron Lake, and Kurt, the man who seems to own half of it. On the surface, Kurt is the affable local success story, the guy who buys drinks, funds school programs, and treats the diner like his personal office. Underneath, he is running his own long-term ritual of abduction, hunting, and preservation, a private kill cycle that has been hiding in plain sight for years. That overlap matters, because this is the story of two predators who both believe the town is theirs to manage. When Dexter kills Matt Caldwell, he thinks he is dealing with a spoiled rich kid whose death can be folded into the snow and forgotten. Kurt's secret life means the opposite. Kurt knows how to make people disappear, how to bend official narratives, how to talk to police and parents and reporters until everyone stops asking questions. He uses those same instincts to probe Jim Lindsay, to test the edges of Dexter's new mask. The pressure multiplies when Harrison enters the picture. You start to see the generational twist as Kurt takes an interest in this angry, drifting teenager who seems drawn to violence. Where earlier villains like Miguel or Trinity mirrored Dexter himself, Kurt mirrors the danger to Dexter's son. He offers Harrison attention, validation, and the promise of understanding, the very things Dexter is struggling to give. And every moment Harrison spends in Kurt's orbit is another chance for Dexter's carefully controlled life to slip. Kurt's real strength is not brute force. It is infrastructure. He knows every back road, every camera, every abandoned site around Iron Lake. He has money, property, and a long-standing relationship with local law enforcement. When you lay them all out together, you start to see how he can redirect searches, stall investigations, and quietly manipulate the sheriff's office while pretending to help. Dexter is no longer the insider at Metro. He is the outsider trying to read a town that Kurt has been scripting for decades. Kurt never fully uncovers Miami, the Slides, or the Bay Harbor Butcher, but his suspicion that Jim Lindsay is not who he claims to be sets off a chain reaction. His cat and mouse games, his taunting videos, his underground trophies, they pull in Angela, they invite outside databases, they make old cases and old sins searchable again. Now, let's notice the shift. The threat is no longer a single crime scene, but the possibility that Dexter's entire history can be connected. In the end, Kurt ranks high not because he alone solves Dexter Morgan, but because his conflict destabilizes everything Dexter. But he is a new kind of threat, the threat of being seen from the inside. On paper, Harrison is what Dexter always said he wanted: a chance to do better, a chance to break the pattern that began in that shipping container and echoed through every season, from Miami to Iron Lake. But that is not the whole story, because as Harrison's own darkness surfaces, as he describes feeling right when he hurts the school bully, you start to see that this is not just a son in need of guidance. This is a living mirror, reflecting Dexter's origin back at him with unnerving clarity. We are going to stay with a few key moments, because when you lay them all out together, the stakes become obvious. There is the confrontation about Rita's death, when Harrison realizes the cheerful story he has been told does not quite fit the facts. There is the scene where he presses Dexter on why he left him, why he vanished from his life, and Dexter's rehearsed absences suddenly sound thin. And there is the long, quiet conversation about the code, where Dexter finally explains Harry's rules and offers them to his son like a twisted inheritance. Each of these moments pushes Dexter into more honesty than he has ever risked with anyone who could testify against him. This is the story of a killer who has spent an entire series controlling information, now volunteering the most incriminating parts of himself to the one person whose word would cut through every mask. A son's testimony about what Dad taught him in the woods would do more than any file at Miami Metro Homicide ever could. Harrison's presence also forces Dexter to relive his own beginning, the blood, the trauma, the way Harry stepped in and tried to shape the monster rather than deny it. When Dexter watches Harrison shake after a violent outburst, he is not just worried about a troubled teenager. He is looking at the proof that the cycle did not end with him, and that it cannot continue unseen without eventually demanding an answer. Now let's notice how that internal pressure combines with external hunters like Kurt. The more Harrison sees, the less room Dexter has to maneuver, morally or physically. Every lie he tells his son tightens one line, every truth tightens another, until you can almost feel that there is only one way this can end. And the next adversary will show us just how little space Dexter has left to move at all. And that tightening space around Dexter does not stay abstract for very long. As New Blood moves toward its end, you start to see something we have been waiting for since Miami, not just a clever suspect or a vengeful survivor, but the larger world finally turning its full attention toward Dexter Morgan. Up to this point in the series, every hunter has been a person. Doakes with his instincts, Lagerda with her files, Trinity with his mirrored family life, Saxon with his cold, opportunistic menace. Each one pushed Dexter, cornered him, made him improvise. But there was always an escape hatch. Someone could be framed, a cabin could burn, evidence could be nudged just far enough off the line to keep his mask intact. In Iron Lake, that begins to fail in a different way. The combined weight of Dexter's past and present actions, all those bodies from Miami, and all those careful kills in the snow, finally triggers a response that is bigger than any single name on our villain list. Local law enforcement, small and under-resourced, suddenly has help. For the first time, Dexter is not just worried about personal revenge or emotional fallout. He is staring at legal accountability. Extradition, trials, evidence chains that do not care how noble his code is. The threat changes flavor here. It is no longer about whether one dangerous man can outwit another, but whether a decades-long pattern of murder can survive contact with a system that is, belatedly, doing what it was designed to do. And every previous near miss suddenly feels like rehearsal for this. Doakes circling the marina, Deborah discovering the slides, Saxon filming him on the table, Trinity forcing him to juggle family and blood. Each season showed us a person getting close. New Blood shows us institutions aligning, police reports, digital records, eyewitness accounts, and a son who has finally seen too much. Now, let's sit with the quiet irony of it. The strongest villain in this ranking is not Trinity's hammer or Brian's intimacy, but the inevitability of exposure itself. No mask can hold forever when worn in front of so many watchful eyes, across so many years, in so many crime scenes. And as we move to our final entry, we're going to watch what happens when that inevitability stops being theoretical and becomes the last choice Dexter ever has to make. So now that we have named the real final villain, the one you cannot stab or wrap in plastic, let's quietly walk back through everyone who led us here. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the noise of individual episodes fade into a single, long line of pressure on Dexter Morgan's mask. At the bottom of the ranking, we place the figures whose chaos stayed mostly outside that mask. These were the seasonal storms that rattled Miami, but never quite rewired Miami Metro homicide around Dexter himself. A cult leader like Travis Marshall can fill a city with apocalyptic imagery and still never truly see the calm blood analyst standing beside him. A cartel threat, a one-off killer, a procedural monster of the week, they matter in the moment. They spill real blood, but they do not meaningfully narrow Dexter's options. When you lay them all out together, you start to see how many supposed big bads are really just weather. Then we moved into the mid-tier, where the danger stops being abstract and starts brushing against Dexter's daily life. Leela understands his darkness emotionally, but not forensically. She can burn cabins and threaten Rita, yet she never builds a case that could survive fluorescent lights and evidence bags. Miguel Prado walks even closer, sharing the ritual, learning the code, almost becoming a second Bay Harbor butcher. But his power is political, not investigative. Jordan Chase and the Barrel Girl Circle pull Dexter into a mess where victims, survivors, and Miami Metro overlap, tightening the radius, but still keeping his full identity just out of reach. The brain surgeon in the later season adds another twist, a killer who studies him, mirrors him, and operates inside the same institutional blind spots that once protected him. These are the villains who could have cracked the mask by accident, through proximity and shared obsession, but never quite held the full picture. At the top, the tone changes. Brian Moser does not suspect Dexter. He knows him, down to the childhood blood and the urge beneath every smile. Trinity never learns the details, but by shattering Dexter's family, he destroys the cover story that made the killings sustainable. Constructed mask. Every close call, every near miss, every time a body turned up a little too close to home. So if you drifted in and out along the way, you have not missed the pattern. From harmless shadows to existential threats, from storms outside to pressure from within, we are going to end with a man who can no longer stay one step ahead, because the noose has finally tightened from every direction at once. When you lay them all out together, every close call, every near miss, you start to see how thin that line really was. Not just the line between freedom and a jail cell, but the line between the Dexter Morgan everyone thought they knew and the thing that kept looking back at him from blood-spattered plastic. For 8 seasons and a return in New Blood, Dexter's mask almost slipped in every direction at once. At crime scenes, where his enthusiasm for blood spatter ran just a little too bright. In conversations, where a question landed a beat too late, or a joke about murder came out just a shade too practiced. In the eyes of people like Doakes, Miguel, Deborah, and eventually Harrison, who each caught a different flicker of the predator under the polite analyst from Miami Metro homicide. Doakes saw the violence. He watched Dexter's stillness, his calculated calm, and recognized a soldier without a uniform. Miguel Prado saw the opportunity. He read Dexter's darkness as a tool he could use, a private weapon in a city that kept slipping through his fingers. Deborah saw the gaps, those missing hours, the evasive answers, the way her brother always seemed to be orbiting the worst moments of her life. Harrison, finally, saw the inheritance, that same hum of rage and dislocation that used to live only in Dexter's inner monologue. This is the story of a man walking a tightrope in a room full of people who refuse to look up. The series keeps returning to that thin line between normalcy and monstrosity, and how often the people around Dexter chose comfort over curiosity. It was easier to accept the donut-bringing lab guy than to interrogate why bodies kept surfacing near his marina, why Miguel changed after late nights with him, why Trinity's shadow seemed to fall directly across Dexter's home. Because the institutions themselves are not neutral. Miami Metro, the FBI task forces, even small-town Iron Lake, all prefer neat answers and familiar narratives. A decorated cop like Doakes fits a convenient villain. A grieving father like Lundy fits the profile of tireless hero, and a quiet blood analyst fits nowhere on their list of suspects. We are going to see that again and again, systemic blindness as a kind of survival instinct. Each major villain presses on a different fault line in Dexter. Brian exposes his longing for family and the terrifying appeal of dropping the code. Leela exposes his arrogance, the belief that he can dabble in chaos and walk away clean. Miguel exposes his hunger for connection, the fantasy that someone can share his secret and not destroy it. Trinity exposes the lie that the code can keep his family safe. Settle in, get comfortable, because once you see that pattern, Dexter's survival starts to look less like genius and more like a long chain of lucky escapes that could never last forever. And the strongest villains are the ones who, for a moment, make you wonder what happens when the luck finally runs out. When you lay them all out together, every villain, every season, every moment where it should have all collapsed, you are not really waiting to see whether he survives. You are watching the same dance of almost and not quite, again and again, until the tension becomes familiar enough that your body stops bracing and starts recognizing the beats. This is the paradox. On first viewing, Trinity or the ice truck killer can feel like an electric jolt, a sudden spike of fear that Dexter is finally outmatched. On a quiet rewatch, we're going to turn those shocks into something else. You start to see the pattern instead of the panic, the misplaced blood slide, the inconvenient witness, the security camera that almost caught his face. Each near miss becomes less a scream and more a wave that rises, curls, and then rolls back without ever quite breaking. Part of what makes it soothing is the world around those crises. Night drives along empty causeways, the soft hum of the air conditioner in the lab, sodium lights pooling on wet asphalt outside Miami Metro. Dexter standing alone in a quiet kitchen, rinsing a knife that is only supposed to have cut vegetables. The ambient details are doing as much work as the plot, wrapping the danger in a low, steady glow that you can sink into. And over time, the villains themselves stop feeling like isolated monsters of the week. Brian, Leela, Miguel, Trinity, Saxon, they become markers along a single, slow trajectory toward exposure. Each one pushes a different fault line in Dexter's life, nudging him closer to being seen, not just by the law, but by Deborah, by Harrison, by anyone who looks at him for a second too long. This is the story of a man whose luck is eroding in plain sight. When you revisit it now, you are not just chasing thrills. You are letting your own fears sit inside a frame that is already fixed. The anxiety of being found out, of making one wrong move, of having your private self dragged into the light, all of that gets projected onto a fictional figure who has already paid the price. Settle in. Get comfortable. Because in that distance there is safety, the uncertainty is contained, the outcome is known, and you can drift with the almost without ever having to live through the impact yourself. And as that distance settles in, we are going to let the sharp edges soften a little. The chase has already happened. The close calls are behind us. Now we can look at the whole thing from far away, almost like lights along a shoreline, fading as the tide. When you lay them all out together, you start to see Dexter Morgan's life as a long, slow slide from control to collapse. In those early Miami days, he walks into Miami Metro homicide with coffee and donuts, the model analyst with the easy smile. At night, he moves through abandoned houses and shipping yards, wrapping rooms in plastic, lining up his tools under fluorescent light. Sunburned days. Refrigerated nights. The same hands that gesture over blood spatter reports are the ones that tape down the last struggling wrist. This is the story of a man who thought he could live forever in that split screen. Season after season, every villain nudges him closer to the edge of it. Brian Moser turns the abstract idea of the code into a family inheritance, pulling Dexter toward the possibility of a life fully unmasked. Miguel parent. Every close call, every suspicious glance. Every near miss is a small crack in the mask. Doakes watching him a little too long in the hallway. Lagerta quietly reopening old files. Harrison's eyes catching something in his father's voice that does not match the words. No one moment is enough to end him, but together they form a kind of gravity, always pulling, always waiting for his footing to slip. And in the end, that is what happens. The palm trees and neon of Miami give way to snow and silence, the bright interrogation rooms replaced by a cabin where no one is asking questions because there is no one left to answer them. Dexter is no longer the hidden predator inside the police station. He is the man who ran out of places to stand between who he is and who he pretends to be. So as you drift, you do not need to hold every detail. Let the specific seasons blur, let the faces of each villain soften at the edges, until all that remains is the outline of a man walking that thin line, almost losing his balance again and again, until finally, quietly, the story closes around him and the tension can finally let go. And if you are still here, still listening, that is enough. Some of you have already slipped under, somewhere back with Trinity in his quiet kitchen, or with Brian Moser in that frozen, impossible room, and the names and seasons have dissolved into something softer than memory. Others are still with us, eyes half closed, letting the last traces of Dexter's world hover at the edge of your attention. You can almost feel Miami Metro homicide falling silent for the night, the fluorescent lights dimming, the case files closing, while Dexter Morgan's long line of enemies folds itself back into the dark. This channel exists for that space, the in-between. We are going to keep building these long, unhurried walks through a series, through a character, through every moment where the mask slips just a little and you start to see the pattern underneath. When you lay them all out together, season after season, villain after villain, the story stops being about jump scares and starts becoming a slow, steady revelation. So settle in, get comfortable with the idea that you can always come back here. This is the story of complicated people in complicated worlds, told at a pace that lets your breathing slow down instead of speed up. We move through Miami at night, through Metro's evidence lockers and quiet corridors, not to jolt you awake, but to give your mind something structured and gentle to drift across. If you feel awake enough, there's a small favor you can do for future, sleepier versions of yourself. You can subscribe, or tap like, or leave a comment about which Dexter villain felt most dangerous to you not in terms of body count, but in that quiet way that made you think, if this one keeps going, he does not get out. Those thoughts help shape where we go next, which seasons we revisit, which masks we study in more detail when the room is dark and you are ready to drift again. But there is no urgency here. You do not have to decide now. You can let this video end, let the room grow quiet, and sometime later, when the day has been loud and you need a familiar voice to walk you back through complex stories at a gentle pace, you can find your way to another long breakdown, another late-night investigation. Out beyond your window, imagine Miami, breath, with Dexter Morgan, and then let him go. Settle in, get comfortable, and on your next inhale, picture the version of Dexter you have carried through every season. The pressed lab coat, the easy smile in the fluorescent halls of Metro Homicide, the careful morning routine, the coffee, the donuts, the blood reports stacked in neat, obedient lines. And then, as you exhale, imagine all of that being set down on a quiet table somewhere you do not have to visit again tonight. The mask goes first. The practiced charm. The way he knew exactly how much emotion to show at a crime scene. The way he laughed at jokes he did not find funny. Then the tools of his trade, both sides of it. The microscope and the knives, the latex gloves and the kill room plastic. Piece by piece, the story of Dexter Morgan becomes something outside of you, like a coat you shrug off at the door. Because, in fiction, we get to walk right up to the edge of exposure without falling in. When you lay them all out together, Brian inviting him into a shared childhood nightmare, Trinity stalking his family, Miguel trying to weaponize the code, Saxon turning the investigation back on him, you start to see how safely dangerous this really is. Every moment where someone almost saw him, almost named him, almost dragged him into a real courtroom, stays on the other side of the screen. Contained inside the series, where consequences are rearranged for effect. Revisiting these villains, from weakest to strongest, is its own kind of tide. A minor threat here, a sloppy killer there, and then the bigger waves. A Bay Harbor task force closing in. A brother who knows his origin. A suburban monster who takes something he cannot get back. Pressure builds, and then it breaks. Over and over, like waves over a shore, that eventually smooth every sharp edge into something you can run your hand across without fear. If you are still awake, you can let the names and the season numbers drift. You do not need to hold on to whether it was Jordan Chase or Travis Marshall, whether it was Miami or Iron Lake, whether the danger came from a crime scene photo or a lover's suspicion. What stays is softer than that, the sense of a long story told from beginning to end, of a mask that almost slipped and then finally, inevitably, did. And there will be other stories like this. Other masks, other double lives, other near misses, where someone stands under bright lights and hopes no one notices the blood on their hands. Whenever you want, you can come back to the sound of almost getting caught, to another investigation, another anti-hero, another long, slow unraveling. Because, even as this one fades out, there is one last thread we have not pulled yet, and once we tug on it, everything you thought was settled might shift again. So we let that thread loosen in your hands, and instead of pulling, we just watch it drift away. Out beyond Dexter, beyond Miami Metro Homicide, into the wider city that is finally starting to quiet down. Somewhere, a siren winds past on an empty highway, rising for a moment, then fading until it is only a memory of sound. The hum of an air conditioner takes over, steady and low, the kind of background noise you stop noticing until everything else has gone still. Out by the docks, the water moves in slow, patient gestures, has finally put its work down. Even the evidence lockers feel quieter as if the boxes and bags and blood slides have agreed to stop telling their stories for a while. Somewhere in there, Dexter Morgan's name exists as a possibility, a suspicion, a question that was never fully written on the board. Now it just rests, like everything else. In that quiet, his whole series becomes another file in your own memory. When you lay them all out together, every villain, every season, every moment he almost slipped, you start to see a pattern you can return to or leave alone. You can pull that folder out again some other night. Or you can let it stay closed on the shelf in the back of your mind, next to other stories that were once urgent and are now just part of the background. So as Miami settles, you can let your body match it. Let your shoulders drop a little farther from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Notice your tongue resting a bit more loosely, your hands no longer braced for the next twist in the plot. Let your breath slow until it moves more like those waves at the dock, in and out, not in a hurry to get anywhere. We're going to let the spaces between words widen now. A sentence. Then a pause that lasts just long enough for your thoughts to wander and come back without feeling like you have missed a crucial line of evidence. The narration softens, the pace stretches, and if you drift in, that is all right. Dexter's file will still be there in the morning, waiting quietly, while the city and your mind both learn how to sleep after the sirens. So as the sirens fade, and Miami settles into that deep, humid dark, we're going to let this story close its eyes for a while too. Every season, every villain, every moment where Dexter Morgan's mask slipped just a fraction can stay right where we have left them, filed away in the quiet corners of your mind. You do not have to hold on to the full case file. Not tonight. If faces blur and timelines loosen, if you forget whether it was Trinity or the ice truck killer standing closest to the line that could not be uncrossed, that is all right. This is the story of keeping your thoughts gently occupied, not of passing an exam in the morning. When you lay them all out together, from Brian waiting in the shadows of Dexter's childhood to Saxon stalking the sterile halls of a hospital, you start to see how inevitable it all feels. But inevitability can wait. The questions about who was truly the strongest, who came closest to pulling him into the light of Metro homicide, can sit on the shelf until you feel like taking them down again. For now, settle in, get comfortable with the idea that this world will still be here whenever you want to return. The blood slides, the boat, the long corridors of Miami Metro, the villains ranked and re-ranked in your head as you drift, they are not going anywhere. Dexter's file does not need you to stand guard over it. If you find that you liked having company in the background while you drifted, you can always come back to this channel. Somewhere here, there will be a long, slow breakdown. Another night where we walk through a series 1, careful scene at a time. If you want to subscribe so those nights are easier to find, you can. If not, we will still be here when you wander back. And if, when you wake up, you remember only fragments,